In the autumn of 1892, in the isolated hills of northern Vermont, where the maple trees burned red against gray October skies, 4-year-old Liddy Connors began speaking about a life she had never lived. What started as childish chatter about imaginary friends soon became something far more disturbing when the little girl began describing places, people, and events with a precision that no child her age could possibly possess. Her words would challenge everything her family believed about memory, identity, and the nature of life itself. Liddy described a small fishing town by the sea, with rows of yellow clapboard houses lining narrow lanes that sloped toward a harbor crowded with boats. She could depict in startling detail. She knew shopkeepers by name, could trace the arrangement of streets and buildings, and even recalled the sound of church bells drifting over waters she had never seen. Most chilling of all, she told of dying in a snowstorm there, recounting the moment of her death with the calm certainty of one remembering an event they had truly experienced. This is the story of a 4-year-old girl with memories that weren't hers, memories of a life that ended before she was born. Her case became one of the most documented in American history, raising unsettling questions about consciousness, memory, and whether death is really the end. Before we begin, remember, this channel investigates cases that challenge our deepest assumptions about existence, death, and the hidden connections that might span across lifetimes. If you're ready to see the world differently, hit subscribe and let me know your state in the comments. The story of Liddy Connors might touch closer to home than you imagine, but Liddy's tale really begins not with her first strange words, but with the isolated community that shaped her early years. Millbrook Hollow, Vermont, in 1892, was a place time seemed to have overlooked, tucked into a valley between forested slopes that lay under snow for half the year. The settlement counted fewer than 150 residents. Their lives had changed little since their ancestors had cleared the land in the 1820s. Farming, logging, and a fierce self-reliance kept the community alive, especially knowing the nearest doctor was a full day's ride away, and winter storms could cut them off from the outside world for weeks. The Connors family had been in Millbrook Hollow since its founding, 3 generations of men working the same stony fields, and women raising children in homes built from timber felled on their own land. Practical, devout Methodists, they had little patience for gossip or superstition. That made Liddy's strange memories all the harder for them to reconcile. At the head of the family stood Samuel Connors, Liddy's grandfather. At 68, he had endured the Civil War, carved a thriving farm from wilderness, and raised 4 capable children. Samuel believed in practical answers and saw unusual behavior as something that could be corrected with discipline and proper guidance. His wife, Martha, was respected throughout the valley for her no-nonsense wisdom and skill as a healer. She could set a bone, deliver a baby, and treat most illnesses with remedies passed down through generations of mountain women. But she also carried what she called mountain sight, an inherited gift for sensing things before they happened, and knowing truths people hadn't spoken aloud. This ability, passed from her grandmother, remembered as a wise woman in the early Vermont settlements, was never spoken of openly and never used for anything beyond helping in times of trouble. Martha trusted her instincts, though she shared them only when it might spare someone harm. Liddy's parents, James and Sarah Connors, lived with their 3 children in a modest house on the family land. James worked alongside his father in the fields and took logging jobs during the long winters. Sarah, still frail since Liddy's difficult birth in 1888, managed the household as best she could. That delivery had nearly taken her life, leaving her weak, prone to headaches, and often dizzy, making the care of an energetic little girl a daily challenge. Liddy had been born during a blizzard that lasted 3 days and left snowdrifts higher than the windows of the farmhouse. The birth was attended by Martha and old Mrs. Whitman, the community's most experienced midwife, but complications arose that nearly claimed both mother and child. Sarah had lost consciousness during the final stages of labor, leaving Martha to deliver the baby while Mrs. Whitman worked to save the mother's life. What troubled Martha about Liddy's birth was not the medical complications, which she had dealt with before, but the strange phenomena that occurred throughout the delivery. Every clock clock in the house stopped at exactly 11:47 p.m., the moment Liddy drew her first breath. The wind outside, which had been howling for hours, suddenly fell silent for exactly 17 minutes before resuming with even greater intensity. Most disturbing, Martha could have sworn she heard voices speaking in the room during the birth, voices that belonged to people who weren't present. Liddy's early development seemed normal in most respects. She was a healthy, active child who learned to walk and talk at the expected times and showed no signs of the physical or mental problems that sometimes affected children who had experienced difficult births. But from her earliest attempts at conversation, Liddy displayed knowledge and interests that puzzled her family. While other children her age played with dolls and toys, Liddy would arrange sticks and stones into patterns that looked like the layouts of buildings and streets. She would create elaborate scenarios involving people with specific names and detailed personal histories, carrying on conversations with imaginary companions who seemed more real to her than the actual people around her. At first, James and Sarah dismissed Liddy's behavior as normal childhood imagination. Many children had imaginary friends and created fantasy worlds that helped them make sense of their limited experience. But as Liddy's stories became more detailed and consistent, her parents began to worry that something unusual was happening with their daughter. The first clear indication that Liddy's memories were different from normal childhood fantasy came in the spring of 1892, when she was 4 years old. She had been playing quietly in the kitchen while Sarah prepared dinner, arranging wooden spoons and kitchen utensils in patterns that seemed deliberate rather than random. When Sarah asked what she was doing, Liddy replied with perfect seriousness, "I'm making the village where I used to live before I came here." Sarah knelt down to look at Liddy's arrangement and saw that the child had created what appeared to be a detailed town layout, with specific buildings placed in relationship to each other and pathways connecting different areas. When asked to explain what she had made, Liddy began describing the village with precision that took Sarah's breath away. "The church is here on the hill," Liddy said, pointing to a wooden spoon she had placed at one end of her arrangement. "And the harbor is down here where the boats come in. Thomas's house is the yellow one with the blue shutters, right next to where Mr. Peterson keeps his nets. The bakery is across from the church, and you can smell the bread baking when the wind comes from the east." The detail in Liddy's description was remarkable for a child who had never been more than 10 miles from Millbrook Hollow. She spoke of tides and fishing boats, of salt air and seagulls, of sounds and smells that she couldn't possibly have experienced in landlocked Vermont. Most disturbing, she spoke of these things with the familiarity of someone who had lived among them for years. When Sarah asked Liddy where this village was located, the little girl pointed toward the eastern hills and said, "It's over there, past the big woods where the water is. Thomas is probably wondering where I went. I told him I would be back before the snow came, but I got lost in the storm and couldn't find my way home." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring air coming through the kitchen window. Liddy was speaking about getting lost in a snowstorm with the matter-of-fact tone that children use to describe actual experiences, not imaginary adventures. More troubling, she was referring to someone named Thomas as if he were a real person who was waiting for her return. That evening, Sarah shared Liddy's statements with James and his parents, describing the child's detailed knowledge of a coastal village and her references to people and places that seemed far too specific to be products of imagination. Samuel dismissed the incident as childhood nonsense that would pass if they didn't encourage it, but Martha listened with growing concern. Martha had heard stories from her own grandmother about children who remembered lives they had never lived, but she had always assumed these were folk tales designed to explain unusual behavior rather than accounts of real phenomena. Now, listening to Sarah's description of Liddy's detailed memories, Martha began to wonder if her grandmother's stories might have contained more truth than she had realized. Over the following weeks, Liddy's references to her other life became more frequent and more detailed. She would speak casually about Thomas Lee, describing him as her husband who worked on fishing boats and who had dark hair that curled when it got wet from sea spray. She knew the names of their neighbors, the layout of their house, and intimate details about their daily routines that seemed impossible for a 4-year-old to invent. Liddy described the village church with remarkable precision, explaining that it had a white steeple with a bell that rang every hour and special chimes that called people to services on Sunday mornings. She knew the name of the minister, Reverend William Hayes, and could describe his appearance and the sound of his voice during sermons. She spoke of sitting in the third pew from the front, on the left side, because that was where Thomas's family had always sat. Most unsettling were Liddy's descriptions of her death in the coastal village. She would speak about getting caught in a snowstorm while walking home from visiting Mrs. Crawford, an elderly neighbor who had been ill. She described the storm developing quickly, with wind and snow that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. She had tried to find shelter, but had become confused and lost, eventually collapsing in the snow, where Thomas found her the next morning. "I was so cold," Liddy would say, with the sadness of someone recounting an actual tragedy. "Thomas was crying when he found me, and Mrs. Hayes from the church was there too. They carried me home, but I couldn't wake up anymore. I watched Thomas sitting by the bed, but I couldn't tell him I was still there." These descriptions of her own death, delivered in Liddy's childish voice, but with emotional weight that seemed entirely adult, disturbed everyone who heard them. The child was recounting her dying and death with details that suggested personal experience rather than childhood imagination. Dr. Robert Morrison, who served the mountain communities throughout the region, examined Liddy in June 1892 after her parents became concerned about her preoccupation with memories that seemed to belong to someone else. Dr. Morrison found the child to be in perfect physical health with normal development and no signs of mental illness or neurological problems. The child displays excellent memory, advanced verbal skills, and emotional maturity that exceeds her chronological age, Dr. Morrison wrote in his medical notes. Her references to experiences in a coastal community are remarkably detailed and consistent, but I can find no medical explanation for how she could possess such specific knowledge about places and people she has never encountered. Dr. Morrison was particularly struck by Liddy's emotional responses when discussing her memories. She would become sad when talking about leaving Thomas behind, anxious when describing the snowstorm that had killed her, and homesick when speaking about the village where she claimed to have lived. These emotional reactions seemed genuine and appropriate to the experiences she described, rather than the detached responses typical of children discussing imaginary scenarios. Martha Connors began keeping detailed records of Liddy's statements about her previous life, writing down the names, places, and events that the child described with such consistency and precision. The records revealed a comprehensive picture of a woman's life in a coastal fishing community, complete with personal relationships, daily routines, and specific knowledge about local customs and geography. According to Liddy's accounts, she had been named Elizabeth Lee in her previous life and had lived in a village called Millhaven on the coast of Maine. She had married Thomas Lee when she was 19 and had lived in the village for 8 years before dying in the snowstorm at age 27. She described their house as a yellow clapboard structure with blue shutters, located on Harbor Street between the Peterson family's house and the village bakery. Liddy knew the names of dozens of people who had lived in Millhaven, describing their occupations, family relationships, and personal characteristics with remarkable detail. She spoke of Captain Samuel Morrison, who owned the largest fishing boat in the harbor, of Mrs. Catherine Hayes, who played the organ at the church, of Dr. William Foster, who had treated her for pneumonia the winter before she died. The child also demonstrated knowledge of fishing techniques, coastal weather patterns, and maritime customs that seemed impossible for someone who had never lived near the ocean. She could describe how nets were mended, how tides affected fishing schedules, and how storms approached from different directions depending on the season. This practical knowledge suggested exposure to coastal life that went far beyond anything she could have learned from books or stories. By the autumn of 1892, Liddy's memories had become so detailed and persistent that her family began to consider the possibility that she might actually be recalling experiences from a previous existence. Samuel remained skeptical, insisting that children often created elaborate fantasy worlds and that Liddy's stories were simply more detailed than most. But Martha and Sarah were increasingly convinced that something extraordinary was happening with the little girl. The turning point came in October 1892, when Liddy began experiencing what she called homesickness for the coastal village where she claimed to have lived. She would stand at the windows of the farmhouse, looking eastward toward the distant mountains, and cry for Thomas and the home she had left behind. Her distress was so genuine and intense that her family worried she might become seriously ill from grief for a life she had never actually lived. "I want to go home to Thomas," Liddy would say through her tears. "He's waiting for me, and I promised I would come back. He doesn't know where I went, and he's probably scared that something happened to me." The child's anguish was heartbreaking to witness, and her family struggled to comfort her without knowing how to address longing for people and places that might not exist. James suggested that they could take a trip to the coast to see if visiting the ocean might satisfy Liddy's homesickness, but the journey would require several days of travel and expense that the family could barely afford. Martha proposed the different solution, based on her grandmother's stories about children who remembered other lives. According to the old tales, these memories would usually fade as children grew older and became more focused on their current existence. The key was to acknowledge the child's experiences without encouraging obsession with the past, allowing the memories to recede naturally as new experiences took their place. But Liddy's memories showed no signs of fading. If anything, they became more vivid and emotionally intense as the months passed. She would wake from sleep calling for Thomas. She would refuse to eat foods that Elizabeth had disliked, and she would become upset when people referred to her as Liddy rather than Elizabeth. The little girl seemed to be living more in her remembered past than in her actual present. Dr. Morrison examined Liddy again in November 1892 and documented changes in her behavior that concerned him. The child was showing signs of depression and anxiety that seemed related to her separation from the life she remembered. She was losing weight, sleeping poorly, and becoming increasingly withdrawn from normal childhood activities. The patient appears to be grieving for people and places that she describes as real, but that have no apparent basis in her actual experience, Dr. Morrison wrote. Her emotional distress is genuine and intense, suggesting that these memories, whatever their origin, have become central to her sense of identity and belonging. Dr. Morrison consulted with colleagues in Boston and New York about Liddy's case, but none had encountered similar phenomena or could suggest effective treatments. The medical community of the 1890s had no framework for understanding apparent past life memories and no established methods for helping children who seemed to be living in two different time periods simultaneously. The winter of 1892 to 1893 was particularly difficult for Liddy and her family. The child's homesickness for her remembered life intensified during the dark months when snow isolated Millbrook Hollow from the outside world. She would spend hours at the windows, watching for breaks in the weather that might allow travel to the coast, where she believed Thomas was waiting for her return. Liddy's depression affected the entire household, as her parents struggled to care for a child who seemed to be mourning the loss of a husband and home that existed only in her memories. Sarah's own health problems were made worse by the stress of watching her daughter suffer for reasons that no one could understand or address. Martha took on much of Liddy's care during this period, using her knowledge of traditional remedies to treat the child's physical symptoms while searching for ways to address the underlying emotional problems. She prepared calming teas from herbs that grew wild in the mountains, created poultices for the headaches that plagued Liddy when her memories became too intense, and told stories designed to redirect the child's attention to her current life and family. But Martha also made a decision that would prove crucial to preserving the record of Liddy's unusual experiences. She began transcribing the child's detailed descriptions of her remembered life, creating a comprehensive account of Elizabeth Lee's existence in Millhaven. Martha's records included maps that Liddy drew of the village layout, lists of names and descriptions of people she claimed to have known, and detailed accounts of daily life in the coastal community. The records revealed the extraordinary consistency and complexity of Liddy's memories. She never contradicted herself when describing people or places, and she could provide additional details about any aspect of her remembered life when asked. Her descriptions of Millhaven included geographical features, architectural details, and local customs that seemed far too specific and comprehensive to be products of a 4-year-old's imagination. Spring arrived late in Millbrook Hollow in 1893, and with it came a gradual improvement in Liddy's emotional state. The longer days and warmer weather seemed to help lift her depression, and she began participating more actively in family activities and childhood games. But her memories of Elizabeth Lee's life remained as vivid and detailed as ever. Morrison's examination of Liddy in May 1893 revealed that her physical health had improved significantly since the winter, but her preoccupation with her remembered past continued to concern him. The child still spoke frequently about Thomas and Millhaven, still drew detailed maps of the coastal village, and still expressed strong desire to return to the life she claimed to remember. The patient has recovered from the depression and anxiety that characterized her condition during the winter months, Dr. Morrison noted. However, her memories of an alternative existence remain as detailed and emotionally significant as ever. She continues to identify more strongly with her remembered identity as Elizabeth Lee than with her actual identity as Liddy Connors. The doctor recommended that the family consider taking Liddy to visit coastal communities in Maine to determine whether exposure to maritime environments might help resolve her obsession with her remembered life. He theorized that seeing actual fishing villages might either satisfy her longing or help her understand that her memories were not based on real places and experiences. But the Connors family's financial situation made extended travel impossible, and Samuel remained reluctant to encourage what he viewed as unhealthy fantasizing. He argued that taking Liddy on expensive trips to search for places that probably didn't exist would only reinforce her delusions and make it harder for her to focus on her real life in Vermont. The compromise solution came from an unexpected source, Reverend David Thompson, the Methodist minister who served Millbrook Hollow and several other mountain communities, had heard about Liddy's unusual memories and offered to help the family investigate their possible basis in reality. Reverend Thompson had connections with churches throughout New England and access to records that might help determine whether the people and places Liddy described had actually existed. Over the summer of 1893, Reverend Thompson conducted extensive correspondence with ministers and town officials in coastal Maine communities, seeking information about a village called Millhaven and the people Liddy claimed to remember. His inquiries included detailed descriptions of the geographical features Liddy had described, the names of residents she claimed to know, and the specific events she remembered from her life as Elizabeth Lee. The results of Reverend Thompson's investigation were both fascinating and frustrating. He found records of several coastal communities that matched aspects of Liddy's descriptions, but no single village that corresponded exactly to her detailed accounts of Millhaven. Some of the names she had mentioned appeared in historical records, but in different locations and time periods than she had specified. Most intriguing was the discovery of records from a village called Mill Point, located on the coast of Maine about 50 miles east of Portland. The community had existed from 1825 to 1878, when economic changes in the fishing industry had caused most residents to relocate to larger towns. Church records from Mill Point included several names that matched Liddy's descriptions, including a Thomas Lee, who had been married to a woman named Elizabeth and who had died in 1885, but the chronology didn't match Liddy's memories exactly. According to the official records, Elizabeth Lee had died in 1870 at the age of 31, not 27 as Liddy claimed. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia rather than exposure during a snowstorm. These discrepancies made it impossible to determine whether Liddy's memories were based on actual historical events or were elaborate fantasies that happened to include some real names and places. Reverend Thompson shared his findings with the Connors family in August 1893, explaining that while he had found tantalizing connections between Liddy's memories and actual historical records, he could not prove that her experiences were based on real events. The evidence was suggestive but not conclusive, leaving the family with more questions than answers about their daughter's unusual condition. Liddy's reaction to learning about the records from Mill Point was complex and emotionally intense. She insisted that the official documents were wrong about some details, particularly the date and manner of Elizabeth's death. She maintained that she had died in a snowstorm in 1871, not from pneumonia in 1870, and she became upset when adults suggested that her memories might not be entirely accurate. "They didn't write it down right," Liddy insisted when shown copies of the death records. "I remember dying in the snow, and I remember Thomas finding me the next morning. The church people didn't know exactly what happened because they weren't there when it happened." The child's certainty about her memories, combined with her emotional distress when they were questioned, convinced Martha that Liddy truly believed she had lived Elizabeth Lee's life, regardless of whether that belief was based on reality or fantasy. Martha decided that the important thing was helping Liddy integrate her memories with her current existence rather than proving or disproving their historical accuracy. As Liddy approached her 6th birthday in the autumn of 1893, her family noticed gradual changes in her relationship with her remembered past. She still spoke about Thomas and Millhaven, but with less emotional intensity and urgency than before. The memories remained vivid and detailed, but they seemed to be receding in importance as Liddy became more engaged with her actual life in Vermont. Dr. Morrison documented these changes in his examination of Liddy in October 1893, noting that the child appeared to be developing a healthier balance between her remembered experiences and her current reality. She was participating more actively in age-appropriate activities, forming friendships with other children in the community, and showing interest in learning skills that would be useful in her actual environment. A patient continues to maintain detailed memories of what she describes as a previous existence, Dr. Morrison wrote. However, these memories no longer dominate her emotional life or interfere with her normal development. She appears to be adapting to the coexistence of two sets of life experiences without the distress that characterized her condition during the previous year. The winter of 1893 to 1894 passed more peacefully than the previous winter had, with Liddy showing few signs of the depression and homesickness that had troubled her family the year before. She still experienced occasional episodes of sadness when thinking about Thomas and her remembered life, but these periods were briefer and less intense than before. By the spring of 1894, Liddy had begun referring to her memories as belonging to before I was Liddy, acknowledging for the first time that her current identity as Liddy Connors was separate from her remembered identity as Elizabeth Lee. This development encouraged her family to hope that she was beginning to understand the difference between her actual experiences and her mysterious memories. But Liddy's memories did not disappear completely. Throughout her childhood and into her teenage years, she would occasionally experience vivid dreams or sudden recollections that brought back details from Elizabeth Lee's life with startling clarity. These episodes became less frequent as she grew older, but they never stopped entirely. Martha continued to document Liddy's memories and experiences, creating a record that would eventually fill several notebooks with detailed accounts of the child's unusual condition. These records became valuable historical documents that provided insight into one of the most remarkable cases of apparent past life recall ever documented in Vermont. As Liddy grew into adolescence, she became increasingly reluctant to discuss her memories of Elizabeth Lee's life. The experiences that had dominated her early childhood became private thoughts that she rarely shared with others. When asked about her unusual memories, she would change the subject or claim that she couldn't remember the details clearly anymore. This withdrawal from discussing her past life memories was probably a normal part of Liddy's psychological development as she focused on building relationships and planning for her future as an adult. But it also meant that much of the detail and emotional significance of her early experiences was lost as she chose to keep those memories to herself. By the time Liddy reached adulthood in the early 1900s, her childhood memories of Elizabeth Lee's life had become family legend rather than active personal experience. She married a local man named William Porter in 1910 and settled into conventional domestic life, raising 3 children and participating in community activities without any apparent connection to her unusual childhood experiences. But the mystery of Liddy's memories would resurface unexpectedly in 1925 when her eldest son decided to take his family on a vacation trip to the Maine coast. The trip was intended as a simple summer holiday, but it provided an opportunity to investigate whether any traces of the places and people Liddy had described in her childhood could still be found. The family's visit to coastal Maine included stops in several fishing communities that matched aspects of Liddy's childhood descriptions of Millhaven. In the village of Mill Point, they found a cemetery with gravestones bearing names that Liddy had mentioned 30 years earlier, including Thomas Lee and Elizabeth Lee, whose graves were located side by side in a section reserved for married couples. Most remarkably, they discovered that the layout of Mill Point matched many of the geographical features that Liddy had described in her detailed maps of Millhaven. The church on the hill, the harbor at the bottom of the main street, and the arrangement of houses and businesses all corresponded to elements from Liddy's childhood memories. When presented with evidence of these connections between her memories and actual historical locations, Liddy's reaction was subdued and somewhat distant. She acknowledged that the similarities were interesting, but insisted that her childhood experiences felt like dreams from long ago rather than actual memories of places she had visited. "I remember thinking those things when I was little," she told her son when he described their discoveries in Maine. "But I don't really remember the feelings anymore, or why those places seem so important to me. It's like trying to remember a dream you had years ago. You know it was vivid when you experienced it, but now it's just fragments that don't connect to anything real." Liddy's detachment from her childhood memories may have been a psychological defense mechanism that allowed her to live a normal adult life without being haunted by experiences that belonged to someone else. Or it may have been a natural consequence of the passage of time and the fading of memories that had never been properly integrated into her sense of personal identity. The records that Martha Connors had kept of Liddy's childhood experiences were preserved by the family and eventually donated to the Vermont Historical Society, where they remain available to researchers studying unusual psychological phenomena and cases of apparent past life recall. These documents provide one of the most detailed accounts of such experiences ever recorded, offering insights into how children process and express memories that seem to belong to other people and other times. Modern researchers who have studied Liddy's case note several characteristics that are common in documented instances of apparent past life recall in children. The memories typically emerge between the ages of 2 and 5, include specific details about people and places that the child has not encountered in their current life, and are accompanied by strong emotional attachments to the remembered experiences. Dr. Jim Tucker, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia who has studied similar cases for decades, has noted that children who report past life memories often show remarkable consistency in their accounts and demonstrate knowledge that cannot be easily explained through normal learning processes. While the mechanisms behind these experiences remain unknown, the patterns are consistent enough to suggest that something significant is occurring that challenges conventional understanding of memory and consciousness. Liddy Connor's case remains one of the most compelling examples of a parent's past life recall in children, both because of the detailed records that were kept and because of the connections that were later discovered between her memories and actual historical events. Whether her experiences represented genuine recollection of a previous existence, elaborate fantasy based on unknown sources of information, or some other psychological phenomenon, her story continues to challenge our understanding of memory, identity, and the nature of consciousness itself. The house where Liddy grew up in Millbrook Hollow still stands, though the community itself has largely disappeared as families moved away, seeking better economic opportunities in larger towns and cities. Local residents who remember the stories about Liddy's unusual childhood experiences say that the house has always felt different from others in the area, as if it retains some trace of the mystery that once surrounded the little girl who remembered a life she had never lived. Some visitors to the area report experiencing unusual dreams or sudden recollections of places they have never been when they spend time near the old Connors property. Whether these experiences are related to Liddy's childhood memories or are simply the result of suggestion and local folklore, they serve as reminders that some mysteries about human consciousness and memory remain beyond our current ability to understand or explain. For those willing to consider the possibility that consciousness might transcend individual lifetimes, Liddy Connor's story offers compelling evidence that memory and identity may be far more complex than we have traditionally believed. Her childhood experiences suggest that the boundaries between past and present, between one person's life and another's, might be more fluid than our conventional understanding allows. Whether Liddy truly remembered living as Elizabeth Lee in a 19th century Maine fishing village, or whether her experiences represented some other form of consciousness phenomenon, her case continues to challenge researchers and philosophers who study the nature of human awareness and the mysterious processes that create our sense of who we are. The child who remembered lives she never lived has left us with questions about memory, identity, and consciousness that may take generations to answer. But her story serves as a reminder that human experience may be far stranger and more wonderful than we have dared to imagine, and that the deepest mysteries of existence may be hidden in the memories of children who speak of places they have never been and people they have never met. What do you think about Liddy Connor's extraordinary memories of a life that seemed to belong to someone else? Do you believe it's possible for children to recall experiences from previous existences? Or do you think there might be other explanations for such detailed knowledge of people and places they had never encountered? Have you ever experienced memories that felt like they belonged to someone else? Or known children who spoke of things they couldn't possibly have learned? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know if you've heard of similar cases in your own family or community. If you found this mystery as intriguing as I did, make sure to subscribe for more stories that challenge our understanding of consciousness, memory, and the nature of human identity. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these investigations into the most puzzling cases in American history. And remember, the most profound truths about human existence often emerge from experiences that seem too extraordinary to believe, waiting for those brave enough to look beyond the boundaries of conventional thinking.